Talk about if we could for a moment, the people, the families and undocumented workers who are in the United States now and are no longer protected by the president's order. That's about 5 million people. Many of them are in states like Texas and California, and Texas, of course, brought the lawsuit. What do you think is going to happen to those people now? They're obviously not going to self-deport. Do you expect now that ICE will go after them? And that the order of the president issued in 2014 that ICE spend its time going after criminals will be voided, and that now they'll go after legal people who are living crime-free lives?
Mm-hmm. Jim, the president's commitment to this policy is unchanged, and our expectation is that the enforcement priorities will remain in place. Primarily because it's just common sense. We've got limited law enforcement resources. That would be bigger if Republicans in Congress had acted. That was part of the comprehensive immigration reform proposal, was to actually better resource border security in our enforcement efforts. So given those limits that Republicans in Congress have put in place on our law enforcement officials, they're going to focus their activities on those who pose a genuine threat to the community or to our national security. And so these are individuals who have been convicted of serious crimes like murder and aggravated robbery, or individuals that have recently crossed the border, individuals that are complicit in gang activity. Those are the areas that should be our focus, and those are the areas that will be our focus moving forward. Now, what the court has prevented is the implementation of executive actions that would actually bring another group of immigrants out of the shadows. And the most significant of these groups, I think, are the parents of American citizens. And these are parents, in many cases, who have been in the United States for more than a decade. And the failed result of a failed policy that has been perpetuated by Republicans in Congress has too often resulted in those families being torn apart. That's not consistent with our values. The other thing is, it's also not consistent with the economic interests of this country. That by bringing these individuals out of the shadows and giving them the opportunity to register and to pay taxes has a whole host of important economic benefits associated with it. In 2024, because, as I was mentioning to Jeff, it's hard to sort of calculate what the take-up rate would be. The CEA has basically said that if this were implemented now, that 10 years from now, what you would see is you'd see an economy that was $100 billion larger, and you would see workers that were getting paid, all workers, getting paid about 0.5% more. What we know right now is that when employers hire undocumented workers under the table, that puts downward pressure on wages. So by bringing these workers out of the shadows, making them register, and giving them the opportunity to get a job and pay taxes, that's actually going to put upward pressure on wages. To say nothing of the impact that it would have in terms of reducing our deficit. The calculation made by the White House is that this would actually reduce the deficit by $30 billion in 2024. So there are a whole host of good economic reasons to allow these executive actions to move forward. And I'll just say something that the president himself has said many times over the last year, which is, if Congress is ready to get to work and actually do the right thing for the country and pass comprehensive immigration reform along the lines of what passed the Senate in bipartisan fashion a couple of years ago, the president would happily rescind his executive order so that the congressionally passed legislation would be the law of the land. Again, I think that highlights how unwise Republicans in Congress have been in trying to set a policy that I think, from a common sense standpoint, would be good for the country, would be good for our economy, and good for our national security.
Let me dig into this just a little bit. You made all these arguments, or the administration made all these arguments before the courts. They didn't buy it. But you're saying that, so what's going to change in the immediate future? Because the administration, you just told me, is not going to move to deport these people who are not breaking the law. and who have citizens who have relatives. They're not going to move to do it. ICE is not going to do it. So what's the difference if they're not processed? That's the only thing that's been changed, is that they won't be processed into being allowed, they won't have an official protection. But in reality, nothing's changed.
Well, I think this highlights the argument that you've also heard us make before, that is consistent with the argument that Senator Rubio has made before, that the broken immigration system that we have in place right now is the closest thing we have to amnesty. And the fact is, by putting in place some reforms that include at least a path to legalization as contemplated in the executive orders, executive actions, and a path to citizenship, as was discussed in the context of the legislation, then you'd have a situation where people would be brought out of the shadows. And you would have much more accountability in the system, because these individuals would be registering with the government, they'd be coming out of the shadows, they'd have to undergo a background check, they'd also have to pay taxes. And so there are a whole host of benefits associated with public safety and for a stronger economy. And so that's what we're missing out on right now because of the rulings from these judges, and also from the continued Republican opposition to immigration reform.
But to be clear, what the administration is saying is that these people will continue to live relatively protected in the shadows because the administration is not going to go after them.
I think, unfortunately, Jim, these individuals don't feel protected. And the fact is, what we want is we want a much more accountable system, where we can focus our law enforcement efforts on those individuals that do pose a genuine threat to public safety, individuals who've been involved in gangs, individuals who've been involved in violent crimes. That's where the focus of our efforts should be. And when it comes to those individuals who are, for example, just trying to raise their American kids, we should try to find a way out of the shadows for them, to allow them to get right with the law, to submit to a background check, and to pay taxes. That's going to have a whole host of benefits for our economy and for our country. And to deny the country and those families those benefits is not in the best interest of our economy, and it only puts those kinds of families at greater risk of being torn apart.
And those 900,000 or so who are now protected by DACA and were not affected by this court ruling, should they feel any more in danger of being not protected anymore, or is the administration going to continue to protect them?
Despite our disappointment with a couple recent court rulings, the legal underpinnings of the DACA law have not been called into question. Okay, Justin.
First, I wanted